So good afternoon. Today we have a prestigious academic. Victor Shih is an associate professor at the University of California, San Diego, and is currently teaching courses on Chinese politics at the University School of Global Policy and Strategy. She is also serving as the director of the 21st Century China Center. He has received his BA from George Washington University and a PhD at Harvard University. He has written numerous books on authoritarian resilience and intra-party factionalism in modern China, with one of the books that I probably have a copy of is nearing the second anniversary of its release, Coalitions of the Weak, which has served as an essential guide to understanding Mao's continued hold on power nearing the end of his life, all the way to the ascendance and consolidation of power under Xi Jinping. He is also a frequent contributor to the American Political Science Review, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Politics, the China Quarterly, and Party Politics, in addition to heading large databases of various elites who occupy important positions within the Chinese Communist Party. So without further ado, I am honored to introduce the Political Science Graduate Student Association's first speaker and guest to the SDSU Political Science Department, Victor Shih.
Hi. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I don't get out here nearly as often as I should. I think last time I was here, it was like almost 10 years ago. There was some kind of conference here on China, actually. It's kind of interesting. But the campus, it's actually, this side of the campus is really nice, actually. So
yes.
I'm glad a chance to walk around a little bit. So should we start this slide here? By the way, I just got promoted. I'm now a full professor. So this just finally, you know. So today I'm going to talk about China's economic policy framework. So it's more institutional, so it's more consistent with your interests anyway. And basically, you know, I think it's in the US, policy is very decentralized, federalist type constitution. Not like Articles of Confederation, not like totally a federalist. But pretty federalist, you know, the state has a lot of authorities, even local governments, even county governments, or some counties like Orange County, which is fabulously wealthy and they can do a lot. Other counties are poor, etc. In China, also had a period of decentralization in the 1980s. But at the top level, of course, the policymakers in China, they have always, since at least 1949, wanted to control the key levers of the economy because, you know, as you all know, China initially copied the Soviet economic system of centralized planning. And so it had tried to do central planning. And then it went through like different periods, and I've got like a few articles on this topic where, you know, in the 1950s, it was largely a Soviet model. And then there was around decentralization with the Great Leap Forward. And then there was re-centralization in the 1960s. And then during the Cultural Revolution, there was very radical decentralization. And that lasted until the 1990s, really. So in the 1990s, the Chinese government began to re-centralize. And as I'll show, now I would say it's hyper-centralized. And in fact, I was just having a breakfast meeting with a friend of mine who's like a professor from China. And he was like, yeah, China has centralized everything. You know, it's great because the central government can control a lot of different things, and we'll get into what they can control. But it also, there's a cost to it, right? So, you know, it's like, you know, when you're still living in your parents' house, it's great, you know, mom and dad will cook the food for you and maybe do your laundry and clean the house for you, et cetera, et cetera. But then you also know it's like, it also sucks because you have no autonomy. You know, it's like that's why people want to move out. You don't really have any incentives to do anything, you know, to redecorate the house because it's not your house. You know, your parents have to give you permission and stuff like that. So your incentives and motivation to do something creative, innovative is just a lot weaker in a highly centralized system. There's a literature showing that. So today I'm not going to talk about the kind of like political economy of it all. So this is mainly descriptive on how the Chinese government make macro level economic policies and the institutions that are involved in making policies at the central level. So that's the talk. But before I do that, a quick bit of propaganda about the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UCSD. So we have all the master's program, but you guys are in master's program already, so that doesn't worry you. But we do have, so this is one thing that people don't often realize. So they always just apply to the political science department at UCSD if they want to do PhD. But actually, there's a joint doctoral program that is joint between GPS and political science. And it's actually easier to get into that program, even though it's exactly the same thing as the political science program. And then you ask, well, first of all, being a UCSD political science student has become a lot more lucrative because we had a strike last year and the salary of graduate students went up by 50% or something like 40% or something like 45%. It's still not great for this area. This is a very expensive area, but I think now the stipend is like $35,000. Plus, if you have summer research appointments, then it gets up to like over $40,000 a year. So that's, you know, even better than working at McDonald's. You know, so usually it's like if you're in grad school and you get paid as much as working at McDonald's, it's pretty good. So in this case, it's actually better. So how do you prepare for application? Usually we are looking for, you know, as you know, the department's very quantitative. So you do have to take some statistics. If you know R coming in, that's, you know, usually a very good marker for us. Yes, all you are painful. Now check. Write some of the code so it's not as hard as before. So our some stats, you don't have to take a lot of stats, but some is certainly helpful. And then also, you know, we do want to see you having a passion in a topic that you're interested in. And as you know, we have, for topics that people are interested in here, like China, Eastern Europe, and in Europe, the European Union, we do have like good people, and especially in the political science department, teaching on all those topics. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have on that. And if you do China, there's a lot of money. So that you're like, well, what does that have to do with, grad students? So people who study China at UCSD, they literally get paid more because we hire them as research assistants. Okay, so back to my talk. Thank you for indulging me. We do want people to apply though, so don't think of it as like this really hard or impossible thing. It's actually every year it changes, and you just don't know. So typically now, like there are long waiting lists for these PhD admissions, and you just don't know. Like some years we take 2 people from the wait list, other years we take 10. Like this year we're gonna end up taking 10 people from the wait list. So all these people were like, oh, I don't have a good shot at getting to UCSD. They got in this year because we went down the wait list. So I urge you all to apply. I mean, I'm not saying that you guys went up on the wait list. Maybe you will just get admitted in the first round, right? But I'm just saying the chance of getting in changes every single year, and you just don't know how things will shake out. Okay, so I'll just very quickly go through the historical decision-making structure, and then something about the current decision-making structure and processes, as well as something about implementing agencies. So in China is different from the United States, like, well, to some extent, right? We do have entities like the Export-Import Bank of America, which most people don't know, but it does exist. the scale is not nearly as big as in China. So, you know, the Exim Bank of the US may make like $3 to $5 billion in loans every year, whereas in China it's like 100 billion in loans every single year. So the scale is quite different. You know, but the Chinese government also controls a lot of companies. They're called state-owned enterprises. Like parts of Europe still, I'm sure have some, you know, France being the case, you know, a lot of SOEs, but in China it's a lot more, you know, SOEs and the companies, they become, in a way, economic agencies because they're certainly economic agents and they can do things for the Chinese government. So this is one thing that the US government is really concerned about. I think sometimes it's warranted, other times it's not. But it's certainly not true that all Chinese companies are like, you know, part of the government. They have to comply with Chinese laws, just like US companies have to comply with US laws. But the state-owned enterprises, they are definitely a part of the government. So that I think is quite clear. And then again, this is not using ChatGPT, it's using more traditional methods, what we call bag of words. I basically go through, so once every 5 years, there's a major Congress, you know, as you know, the party Congress, and there's a long speech, but the long speech, you know, people are like, oh, you know, this long speech given by Xi Jinping, I'll just fall asleep and ignore it. It's actually quite important because it actually lays out what the government wants to do in 100 different policy areas. But then you can actually basically look at the speech and say, hey, here are the 100 things the Chinese government actually cares about. And then you can map in subsequent to the party Congress, how much do the elites in China talk about these issues when they have meetings, other kinds of meetings, right, besides party Congress. So this is kind of what I try to do here. Okay. So in China's political system, this is kind of basic stuff. I'm sure most of you know this. You know, major decisions at the national level, and you know, today I talk about economic issues, but this pertains to everything. You know, the media, foreign policy, social issues, really any big issue you can think of that, you know, for a country, the Chinese Communist Party will have a say about it. Major decisions across the board are always made by organs subordinate to the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. So all of these different things, they're nominally subordinate, but actually in the case of the Politburo Standing Committee, of course, that's above the Central Committee. But if you look at the party constitution, it always says like, oh, the Central Committee makes, you know, is the ultimate, you know, authority in the party. But of course, the key decision makers, including Xi Jinping, are in the Politburo Standing Committee, and it meets at least once a week, sometimes every single day. So during COVID, we know the first, you know, 3 months of COVID, the Politburo Standing Committee met every single day because it was, you know, obviously national emergency, et cetera, et cetera. And also we got very good data actually at that time because they would announce to the public when they would meet. Now they don't announce to the public when they meet, but we can kind of figure out that it's roughly speaking once a week, sometimes more, sometimes a little bit less. The Politburo meetings, those are announced publicly and they meet once a month. And then you have leading groups of the Central Committee. When they get big, they become commission. And when I ask people in China, what's the difference between a leading group and a commission, they just say, oh, it's bigger. So, you know, there you go. And it's basically just, so you're like, what the hell is it? So basically the structure of a leading group is, let's say you have a leading group on financial policy, right? Which I'll talk about a little bit. You have a very high level official. So in this case, I think actually Xi Jinping is the nominal head of the finance leading group, but the person who's in charge of it on a day-to-day basis is the vice premier of China, this guy named He Lifeng. So you have one guy who's at least in the Politburo, if not in the Politburo Standing Committee, And then you have a bunch of ministers, right? So you say have like 5 ministers, sometimes 10. And they're ministers in the area that is germane to the topic of the leading group. So, like the finance leading group would include the central bank governor, the head of the economic planning agency called NDRC, and also the Minister of Finance, and also the stock market regulator, right? And so they would discuss the specific in policies in that domain. And then they'll say, okay, this is a good idea. This is how we need to regulate, the financial system or the stock market or whatever. Then they make the policy, they give it to Xi Jinping, because Xi Jinping is still the head of the leading group or whatever. He signs, right? So Xi Jinping signs, and then the leading group gives it to, so the leading group is just a bunch of officials, so they can't carry out policies. So they have to give the new decree to the actual agencies, which I'll talk about, and they implement the policies, right? So that's broadly speaking how things work in China. When there's a big kind of reorientation of policies, it's like, for example, poverty is a big issue in China. We have to fight poverty. So this literally happened 10 years ago. In a central committee plenum, they will pass a resolution saying that we will fight poverty from now on. So that's just like a big reorientation of general policies. You say, oh, well, how do you fight policies? Like, oh, well, you need, more subsidies for the poor, you need more medical health care for, migrant workers or something like that. Those specific policies now are discussed and passed in the leading groups. So basically, the larger the body, the more vague the policies they're in charge of. So the party Congress also, they sometimes will like say, oh, we want to change our priorities to whatever, competing with the US. But that's all it would say. It's like, we are competing with the US, but like how to do it, what to compete with the US on, et cetera, et cetera. All that will be discussed in the leading groups. And it used to be there weren't so many leading groups because the party's like, well, for most things, it's not really, we shouldn't be so specific about our concerns about most things. So they would let the ministries worry about it. But one of the big changes that Xi Jinping, so the state council is the state side. So these are all party organs. The final two are state. So in China, just like back in the Soviet Union, you have the state side and the party side. But basically in recent years, the party has taken over the functions of the state. So the state council now doesn't do very much. They just implement, right? So they just get an order from the party. The party says, we have to fight poverty and also try to fight it in the following way, subsidies. Now the ministry, you have to draft the specific regulation on how to subsidize, poor children, or something like that. So that's roughly speaking the role of all these different bodies. So historically, I mean, this is not going to be of interest to anyone. You always have the political leader, sometimes the political leader of the party, plus a key technocrat, right? So in these key technocrats, they vary in different periods. So before the Xi Jinping period, you had this guy Wen Jiabao. And then during the Xi Jinping period, he is pretty involved actually, even in economic policies, even though we're like, why are you so involved? Do you know much about economics? But also these other key technocrats would help him, Liu He and because now actually there's yet another group of people. So those two guys have retired actually a couple of years ago. By the way, if you have any questions, just raise your hand. Yeah, please go ahead.
So there's one thing, so I know because China is not a democracy, but how are these technocrats determined? Like how is there
yeah, very good question. So at the party Congress, once every 5 years, they will pick members of the Politburo. And you have to be in the Politburo to be powerful, at least the Politburo, if not the Politburo Standing Committee. And then once you get picked in the Politburo, then they'll assign like a state position to you also, right? So then usually if you're a technocrat, you become a premier or a vice premier of China. So usually what happens is there's a party congress once every 5 years. You find out you get in the Politburo. 3 months later, there's a National People's Congress session, which is a state legislative body. So the National People's Congress works just like any Congress around the world, like in Germany or, in the United States or whatever. They will vote to make someone who already is in the Politburo, make that person a minister or a vice premier or the premier of the country. And then they will officially take charge of, economic ministries, right? But you cannot be made a vice premier of China unless you are in the Politburo by the party, right? So that's the power of the party, because they basically say, if you're not, oh, hi, welcome.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just saying some very basic stuff about China. But it gets into a very interesting discussion here. So you cannot be a vice premier of China unless you're a Chinese Communist Party member and unless you get selected into the Politburo in the first place. Which I guess is kind of similar to like some parliamentary system. Like you have to be an elected parliamentarian of the winning coalition or the winning party before you can be made a minister, right? Okay, so yeah, so you become, so they're like these technocrats. So it's like, well, what makes them technocrats? What makes them technocrats is like, historically, at least this is what my first book is about. Some of these people, like this sort of this guy, they have not had a lot of work experience at the local level. So they served either very short stints as a provincial party secretary or no experience whatsoever. They've always worked in the central government. So their power base is in the central government. So they really care about the interests of the central government. They want to maximize revenue that's collected by the central government, as well as other kinds of power, like regulatory power, etc. So today in China, there's this organ, it's called the Central Finance and Economic Leading Group. Actually, it just got upgraded to a commission. Again, it just means that more people. It is again officially led by Xi Jinping, but the vice director of this commission is Li Qiang, who's the premier of China. But again, it's like, well, how did Li Qiang become, the vice head of this leading group? The process is he first had to get into the Politburo, and actually in his case, he entered the Politburo Standing Committee. Then he was simultaneously chosen to be the vice head of this very important body. Then he was also elected as the premier of China at the National People's Congress, right? So you first have to have party, then you get your state position, or you have no power in China. So it's a very powerful organ. A lot of the economic issues, except for finance. So now finance gets its own leading group, so that's a separate body. But like other than finance, all the major economic policies have to be discussed and approved by this leading group. Or sometimes if it's a very big reorientation of policy, they have to forward it to the Politburo Standing Committee or the Central Committee for a vote. But of course, if they favor it, the Central Committee is going to pass it because the head of this leading group is Xi Jinping, and he basically decides everything. So some examples of their power is China makes an economic plan still. There's a 5-year plan. They're in charge of drafting of the 5-year plan. And I have friends who are involved with that. It's very detailed. It's like every single sector is like, oh, in the car industry, we want to increase production by, whatever, 30%. We want to have, 50% of the production be EVs, and so all these things, it's not accidents. Like these economic plans will have a lot of incentives to try to make sure that these outcomes actually happen. It's part of the reason why China is, producing so many EVs is because 10 years ago, the 5-year plan called for a dramatic increase in EV production. And all these incentives were put in place to try to make it happen. So any big changes in monetary policy, like interest rate cuts, interest rate increases, it's not, so in the US, it's like the Federal Reserve, they decide on it. In China, is this party leading group will make a decision. They, of course, will give it to the central bank will implement it. The leading group approves reforms of the stock market, or recently they just banned derivative trading just because it was causing too much volatility in the market. This, by the way, is what Elizabeth Warren would like to do, ban derivatives trading. China did it. I used to be in the market, so I'm a bit biased. I think it's good to have derivatives, but we can get into that. So yeah, so even sometimes, even like you say, it kind of narrow issues, like how big should China's strategic oil reserve should be? What is the minimum threshold for China's foreign exchange reserve? So these are all things that are decided by the leading group, we think, right? So we don't know for sure, but we think. Because just the central bank, they're too weak in a sense to decide on big issues like that. So it has to be someone higher, and that body must be, the Central Finance and Economic Leading Group. The appointment of key economic officials at the ministerial, so the ministerial level was decided by Politburo Standing Committee, but the vice ministers are decided by the leading groups from what we can gather. So again, so in China, you first have to have the party approval, then the state can officially appoint you to some position. Yeah, so agriculture and finance are the exceptions. They're not controlled by this leading group, but by some other leading group. So here is a kind of a universe of all the different leading groups. So you have all kinds of stuff. And this is done by a German think tank. It's a little bit out of date, but broadly speaking, still the same thing. You have a reform leading group now. But there's leading group for a lot of different things. There's one for Xinjiang, Tibet, one for anti-corruption, one for inspection, which is also anti-corruption. So anti-corruption has two leading groups, so you can see how bad the problem is. One for inspection, one for anti-corruption. There's one for, there's multiple leading groups on ideology. There's one for education work, which is basically ideology. There's cybersecurity, obviously. There's one even for party history. So how to write the history of the Chinese Communist Party. With the leading group, you have to write it a certain way, No, actually, this book is banned in China because it's not the official party history of China. Wow. So it tells a very heterodox story. No, but I always ask my Chinese parents, like, do you think I'll get in trouble if I bring the book in? They're like, well, I don't know, like everyone has read it. I'm like, how is it possible? It's a banned book. It's like, well, you like put it in a zip file and you can set it on WeChat. So the pirated copy, there's like, yeah, but if you're caught with a physical copy, like you won't get in trouble, but they'll just like confiscate it. So there's nothing against, as you know, there's nothing against the party in the book. It's just tells a different version of the history than is officially approved. So that's why they would confiscate it. Yeah, so there are all these different leading groups. So decision-making process, and I went into it a little bit already. So the ideas come from a lot of different places. Like sometimes it's Xi Jinping's own instruction. So this turns out to be quite important. So we know that Xi Jinping every year will read through thousands of reports, right? Because he's the emperor, he makes all the decisions, and China's a big country, it's a very complicated place. So all the different ministries and sometimes even universities would send him reports about different things. Sometimes it's policy recommendation, other times is a report of a problem that's happening, right? Like, oh, the roads are not, have a lot of potholes or something like that in a major city. If he writes on the margin with his pen, so his pen has a special color, do something, fix the road in Xi'an, or something like that, that becomes law. So then, his office will give it to the leading group, sometimes directly to the ministry and say, Xi Jinping just said, fix all the roads in Xi'an. And then they just have to do it, because but as we discovered, not everything he said becomes law, but a lot of what he says become law. So then you're like, what's the point of being a dictator? That's the point. Whatever you want becomes the legal law of the land, and it's kind of a cool thing. It's what we call like a payoff, right? But sometimes policy ideas really come from the grassroots. So not grassroots in the sense, not like the people, but like all these think tanks attached to the central government, they do a lot of research, right? So they will send teams of people going around China. If they're interested in, on an industrial issues, like, oh, how's our battery manufacturing base doing? They will send a team to go to, 10 different battery factories to see if there's any problem, how's the export market, what problems are they running into when they're trying to produce, to source the lithium, et cetera, et cetera. They'll write it up and they say, okay, our battery sector is doing pretty well, except for the following problem. It's hard to anticipate the price of lithium, whatever it is, they'll write it up. And then they'll make some recommendation about what to do. The leading groups, sometimes the Politburo Standing Committee itself will consider some of these policy recommendations. It's like, oh, we need to buy more lithium mines in South America so we have greater control of the supply chain, or something like that. I don't know. Well, they do that sometimes. They do buy up. What I'm saying is, when you see a big purchase by a state-owned enterprise, especially, that is not a commercial decision. That is the leading group of the Chinese Communist Party making that decision. Especially if it's over, $100 million, let's say. If it's like a small acquisition, then maybe it's just the company decides to do it. But when, like there are like these China Alco, right? So it's like a big aluminum state-owned enterprise in China. When they make a major acquisition over $100 million in a foreign country, it has to get approved by, the leading group or even by the Politburo. Right. And then you're like, well, why is that necessary? Because basically, if it goes wrong, right? So in a lot of investment goes wrong, then it's state assets that gets lost. So no state-owned enterprise would dare to do that on their own without political coverage. Right? So if they make a big investment, it's like, okay, this could work out well. We could make a lot of money, or we could lose $100 million. I personally cannot bear the responsibility of losing $100 million, so I better get someone high up to approve it. If they approve it, I have this piece of paper that says, the leading group approves this. I make the investment. There's a big loss. So like Angola was a big loss. Guess what? No one lost their job because, they got the approval of the leading group. They did it. They lost billions of dollars, and it was perfectly fine because there's political coverage, right? They decide, and then there's a unique step in China. It's called conveying, right? So if it's a big reorientation of policy, and a few years ago, Xi Jinping himself wanted to launch a big anti-poverty campaign. He held a 2-day-long national meeting, got all the provincial party secretaries and governors and ministers together and say, look, guys, this is what we're going to do. You will use your resources to fight poverty, in the following places. It wasn't like a permanent program. So as China did not institute, a transfer mechanism to help the poor or something. It's just like for the next year, you will, whatever money you have, you will spend a part of it to give to poor places in China. So for a year, people just had to do it. But there is conveying is an important step because Xi Jinping's time is very limited. So if he spends a whole day, trying to convince local officials to do something, they know it's a serious issue, And then finally, there's implementation, which is done by the ministers or sometimes the provincial leaders. Any questions up to this point? Sorry, it's like a lot of details.
No, it's-
Very instant. Yeah, please, yeah.
Sorry, hi, I apologize for coming in 10 minutes late and you probably already answered it,
No.
but I was actually genuinely curious. So you have these leading groups here.
Yeah,
And you have the Politburo and the Communist Party, and you have these various state-owned corporations.
yeah.
Because I was thinking like Arcor, the Chinese steel company also has multinational elements to it.
Yes.
Is it not like, because Mitchell, Arcor, they have like various. So in a sense, what is the relationship, you said the decisions are not commercial, they're political.
Yeah.
But what is the relationship between the political and the commercial, even in the constitution of the Politburo itself? You told us like she is an authoritarian leader, which I'm totally on board with, and and so there's something about that. And I also curious about your book, and the official history of the CCP is quite different from the reality of the CCP.
Yeah.
As we know. So, but what is the relationship of this CCP to what is seen as commercial? As in, to what extent is, because in a sense, when you think about pre-Deng CCP and the relationship of politics and economics in China, so I was just curious, in the sense, who constitutes the leading group? Like, are these part of the new entrepreneurial class?
Oh, no, so the leading groups, they're all party elites. The private sectors, the only body they get to participate in, it's a National People's Congress, which I would say is a rubber stamp organ, right? So this thing. So you have even basketball stars. Yao Ming is, you guys know this former. Well, yes, you're too young to know.
They may be too young.
Each
year as we teach.
I know, like you don't know who Yao Ming is.
Yeah.
I played for the Houston Rockets. Very good basketball player. And now he's in the National People's Congress. You have a bunch of entrepreneurs. The laws. So what they can do is actually they do submit. So there's some research on this. They submit these legislative recommendations, but the laws are drafted in committees, and the committees are run by the party. So even in the National People's Congress, which is the least sort of controlled by the party directly, the actual power resides with the party. The head of the Congress, National People's Congress, is a Politburo Standing Committee member. So again, you first have to be approved by the party before you enter any of these legislative bodies. Same thing with the SOEs, right? So the head of the big SOEs in China, they are all party members, and many of them are in the Central Committee. Right? So you first have to have party position before they will trust you with a big job like being the head of a state-owned enterprise. There used to be a couple of exceptions in the foreign overseas subsidiary of large SOEs. So some of those people were recruited kind of globally. They still have to have Chinese citizenship. So that's so far a state-owned enterprise, you still have to do that. But they were recruited sort of on a meritocratic basis, at least. Xi Jinping has gone back to the older system of saying that, oh, look, you have to be a trusted cadre of the party. You have to be moving up the system, So there used to be these people who were like, oh, I worked in Goldman Sachs for 10 years. Now I'm going to go work for a Chinese, company. That used to be okay, but more recently it's not okay anymore. So they have taken away. Because you're right, you do want the best people to work for these state-owned companies because they're trying to make money after all. But recently, Xi Jinping's like, no, actually, I care more about political loyalty. You know, I want to know that this person can be trusted and so on and so forth. So now they're using more, I would say, exclusively insiders who have been promoted from within the party.
I think you have a question and I will say now because I think it relates.
Yeah.
So some specialists say that China got to its maximum economic capacity inside its model. So with this hyper centralized model, do you see like a certain flexibility when the political issues is set aside just to actually make money? So what I'm trying to ask is like, do they ever broke the pattern, like just to focus on economic? Yes.
Yeah. Well, so every cadre in the Chinese government, and including the bosses of state-owned enterprises, they get evaluated by the party every year. So I've seen, exactly how they do it is kind of a secret, but I've seen the evaluation form for some officials. So the way it looks is this. So it's like, let's say you're a state-owned enterprise boss. It will say, okay, there's 100 points in your evaluation. 40% of that is profit, but the other 60% will break down to like party recruitment, you know, maintaining social stability in your company, you know, sometimes even like depending on, you know, if you have an overseas branch, you know, helping with China's diplomatic efforts. So even though profit is in there, it's not 100%, right? So in a way, I mean, it's not that different from in the US, right? So the US is also not just profit. Now you have like all these ESG issues and like, you know, you can't get sued and, you know, all that kind of stuff. In China, it's more of an explicit system. So they literally will say profit will matter for 40% of the evaluation. Whether or not someone gets promoted is not just dependent on your evaluation every year. Also depends on your political connection, right? So if you're like the nephew of Xi Jinping, then you know, obviously, even if you perform very poorly, in fact, we have some research that shows that like the people who have connections to Xi Jinping, they are not the best performers. They're actually very mediocre because they don't care. They're just going to get promoted anyway. So it doesn't really matter, you know, what job they do.
Unless they fall out of favor.
Right, exactly.
In which case, it still doesn't matter whether or not they do well.
I mean, they can perform really, really badly, right? So if they're responsible for a big disaster or something like that, that's quite bad. We've seen people, like even very connected people, get in trouble if they, you know, they're responsible for a big disaster. Yeah, so the answer is profit and revenue, they matter, but it's not 100%. It's not even close to 100%. It's something like 30 to 40%. Yeah, so let me get to the text analysis part a little bit. Oh yeah, so these are all the think tanks in China. So it's a mix of, so you have these pure think tanks that are attached to the government, you know, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. It's kind of like the Soviet system, you know, so these things existed in Soviet. You have like things that are attached to universities, so National School of Development, I'm quite close to them, Peking University. All the ministries will have their own think tank. The PLA, obviously, the military has a bunch of think tanks, you know, etc. So they help in the policy advisement. The regulatory and the core economic agencies are, you know, central bank, Ministry of Finance. In China, it's slightly different. There's like an economic planning agency, the National Development Reform Commission. So they do the actual drafting of the 5-year plans. Now there's a National Finance Regulatory Administration. They do all the financial regulation. And then to run all the state-owned enterprises, you have State Asset Supervision and Administrative Commission, SASAC. So institutionally, when you see a large state-owned enterprise in China, you know, either in China or overseas, their owners is SASAC. It's the basically, if you look for shareholders, the SASAC, the actual boss, of course, is the Chinese Communist Party, because again, no SOE boss can take that position without the party's approval. So again, one thing about policy implementation in China is that because it's all run by one party, the central SOEs will work in tandem with the banks, with the local governments, etc. So this is why during COVID, you see something that is really not possible in the United States, right? So the entire city locked down. Then all the company, not all, but like many companies in China, they get mobilized so China built these hospitals, right? Like thousands of temporary hospitals to house people who are infected with COVID. And these were built in, 30 to 60 days. It's like, how's that possible? It's because many of the biggest construction companies in China, they are state-owned enterprises. But like in the US, is like, even if some companies like, I'm gonna build you a hospital for free, there would still be all the municipal governments like, oh, well, we gotta find a piece of land. Oh, this land is protected by, by mushrooms or something, whatever. All the licensing, and it will go through, but in China, because it's all the party, the central government just called up the city government, like in Wuhan, and say, this piece of land is designated for a temporary field hospital. This company is going to come and build it. You have to let them do it in the next, 2 hours. And they start building it. And it was built in like a week, basically. So the first field hospital was completed in a week. Enormous amount of coordination in times of emergency. I do have to say, this kind of system works not well at all for chronic problems. So there are a lot of chronic problems, undereducation of rural children, a lot of infectious disease, a lot of like just chemical pollutants that causes cancer like crazy in China. It doesn't get the attention of the central leadership because everything's top down. It gets neglected. No one cares. There's no democratic pressure to, make a stink of it. And a lot of chronic problems just fester and fester and fester. If it's an emergency, this system deals with it very, very well, very, very quickly, because it's one single source of coordination. If the party center says, we need to do this, we got to devote everything, everyone plays along, everyone coordinates. So that's a power kind of the system. Okay, so here's the empirical part. I'll just go through it quickly before Q&A. So what I did was I collected a database of what I call elite policy meetings. So elite policy meetings are meetings attended by more than one Politburo member, and where the main audience, so sometimes the party will hold meetings with like ordinary people, for propaganda purposes, but the main audience of the meetings that I care about, they are attended by party officials or government officials. So these are, what the elites would talk about. So there are like different kinds, you have the official Politburo meetings, you have leading group meetings, obviously leading groups, but then sometimes you have special work conferences for regional development. So recently China wants to, increase growth in central China. They had a special meeting, like, okay, we have to build, 10 new bridges next year so that growth rate is higher in the following provinces, etc. Sometimes you have a specialized meeting with technical experts or entrepreneurs who are approved by the party, right? So if you're officially a member of the National People's Congress, you get invited to face-to-face meetings with party elites. Even though you yourself, you're not a party elite, it's still a very high-level meeting, and sometimes some meaningful policy content would come out of it. So again, I have a lot of meetings, but today I will focus just on the economic meetings. So the economic meetings, even in the 2017 to 2022 period, this is basically the period of the 19th Party Congress, right? So that's the period of 19th Party Congress. The Politburo meeting number is not completely accurate because there are some secret Politburo meetings that we don't know about. So that can't be helped. That's just the nature of the beast. The central work conferences, it's pretty accurate data. So you can see, so these are half-year increments, just frequency, right? Leading group meetings, again, not 100% accurate because there are some leading group meetings that are secret. So there's a leading group on state security, for example, it's where all the spies get together. We don't know when that happened, it's just, that's a secret. Then you have finance and economic leading group, regional economic work conferences, and then central meetings with non-party elites. So you have the frequency. Then here's a little bit of big data, but it's very basic stuff. It's just bag of words. Like basically, we know the party when they consider different policy issues is very well cataloged during the party congress. So the party congress speech is like this 5-hour long ordeal, where Xi Jinping goes on stage and read this 5-hour long speech. Everybody falls asleep, but it actually is a very content-rich speech where he discusses 100 different policy topics. So if you actually catalog all 100 topics and you look for similar words that get mentioned in the press reports of all these other meetings, then you can track how frequently these other topics get discussed at elite meetings over time. So this is basically what I've done. So obviously this was COVID, right? When COVID happened, everything got dropped and all the focus, became COVID, the first half of 2020. So that makes sense. But what's really interesting is that for big data, smart manufacturing, and scientific research, so these are the two darker blue lines, with the exception of the COVID period, is a perennial obsession of the party elite. So for the party elites, they really care about this kind of smart manufacturing. So in fact, between 30, so this is 30.2 is 30%, 25 is 50% of the elite meetings in these half-year increments would discuss smart manufacturing, big data, or scientific research, right? So that's quite a bit. It's like half the meetings you have, you're like, oh, how do we get our science better? How do we, in the US, it's maybe 1%, so who knows, right? US doesn't care about science, politicians, they care about getting reelected. So they're always talking about, oh, let's create jobs, let's whatever. Science is not important, but in China, hugely important all the time. You have some topics that are sometimes important, sometimes not. So this one, rural-urban integration, this was a hot topic right after the Party Congress, but then it fell in favor, and by the first half of 2022, it's irrelevant. They don't really talk about it anymore. So that's pretty interesting. So I have other topics just to show you. Some of the topics are always discussed a lot. They always, oddly, there's been this pretty consistent attempt to make the domestic market more fair, because there's always this fear that the SOEs will just take over everything. So it's like, no, we need to create space for our private sector. They at least will pay a lot of lip service, right? So whether or not it translates to reality, that's different. But at least the elites will talk about it. They were worried about housing prices being too high for much of this period. Growth is always very important, obviously. And also financial stability, which is this lighter blue line. Sometimes it's discussed 50% of the time. Other times it's discussed 20 to 30% of the time. So this is just, these are variables. So I haven't used it on regression analysis. I don't know what to do with it in a sense, there's some endogeneity. But COVID is a nice shock, right? So basically it sets up such that you can say, oh, well, obviously during COVID, all the attention was in COVID, but afterward, you really can see like what they paid attention to, and you can use that to explain the other stuff. There's some topics that are kind of mentioned at the speech every 5 years, but then later on they get neglected. Like free trade zones is always mentioned, or SOE, even SOE reform, which can get hotter sometimes. 15% of the meetings will talk about SOE reform, but it's just 15% of the time versus science and technology, which would be discussed 30 to 40% of the time. So it's still kind of a big difference. Anyway, so this is some of the topics that I have, and I will stop here and I welcome any questions.
Yeah. So you mentioned I was wondering what smart means in a Chinese context, because it has a meaning in the US where it's associated usually specifically with more efficient, like energy efficiency, or integrating like AI with things, or more environmentally friendly kinds of things. What are they actually looking for to make things smarter?
So it's two things. One is so this was an issue in the US, right? So these US ports bought the smart cranes from China, and then Congress was like, oh my God, this is Chinese spying, and like force all the ports to like uninstall all the Chinese cranes. So smart equipment is two things. One is equipment, either kind of logistics equipment or manufacturing equipment that allows the owner to collect data. Right.
Okay.
So that's the problem with these smart cranes. Like it's always collecting data on like how heavy stuff. I don't know what other data it collects. The other thing is it's automatic, right? So it's automated, right? So whereas before maybe you need a human being to like control, like a robotic arm to do. In China, for example, like the ports, I know they really are smart. Like don't see anybody there. You just have like these machines that can like move sideways, and it just picks up stuff and move it to the right place, and there's no human intervention. It just does it automatically. So it's like automated operation and the ability to collect data of what it's doing. So that's what the Chinese government means by smart logistics and smart manufacturing.
I know this is a bit maybe going back to a further topic that you discussed earlier.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming.
But I know you mentioned WeChat, and for example, that some of people are able to read your book through WeChat. So do you think in recent years there's been kind of a shift away from like severely supervising people, or do you think that there's still a fear when using WeChat? Or is that kind of hard to?
It's gotten worse, actually. Overall, it's gotten worse. There's a lot more censorship. You can feel it in the universities. Like, for example, you used to be able to, at least in the top universities, you can talk about democratic political systems. You can say, oh, this is how democracies work, people vote, and then there's elected representatives, so on and so forth. Now you have to get approval before you teach about democracy. How it works. I mean, you can say generally just like, oh, democracies are in decay, they're pieces of crap, that's okay. But if you teach how democracies operate, like in a comparative politics class, you need approval to do that.
And then I noticed that like China has been allowing for a lot of students to become like exchange students, even like at places such as SDSU or UCSD. Do you think when they return that there's like a problem with that, or do you think China is maybe trying to cut down on exposure to democratic systems? Or is that maybe kind of a question that isn't really?
Yeah, so that's what they're trying to do, cut down. I mean, that's why, so there's sometimes it backfires, right? So as you know, there's like a firewall, and it's not easy for people to get out. But then at the same time, they're banning video games, right? In China. Well, they're limiting how much playtime you have. So that actually motivates people who never care about politics to go over the firewalls. Like, I want to play video games, I want to watch some cool YouTube videos. about some stupid topic. So they do it, and then suddenly they're like, oh my God, there's all this political content out there. So it backfires sometimes.
I'm curious on the neglected topics with like leasing option for housing and land ownership.
Yeah.
Has any of the discourse really changed ever since the issues with Evergrande and the real estate market right now? Or is there any sort of?
Yeah, so housing, so there was one that's not. So maybe I'm like out of.
Oh,
something.
sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, but it's okay.
I think maybe, yeah, I'm sure. I hope.
Well, even if you can scroll back one slide, I think. Yeah, so there's control housing prices, right? Yeah, so you see the beginning of this transition. So COVID, obviously, they don't talk about housing prices. Then actually, as the price of housing started to flatten and go down, at first it became less of a problem, but then by now it's a huge problem. So they are talking about it a lot. I just haven't updated my data.
Okay.
I mean, I've collected the data, but I haven't made it in the next chart yet.
So this is a bit of an earlier topic, sorry to go back to it, but would you say that the political restrictiveness placed upon international SOEs by Xi Jinping and the Communist Party reduced the efficiency of the SOEs international markets and the Chinese economy?
Yeah, no, of course. But you know, for the Chinese Communist Party, it's a political party. Its main objective is not to make money, it's not to enhance efficiency. It wants to stay in power. So they'll just do whatever it thinks or the leadership thinks is more conducive to staying in power. Sometimes they do just really stupid thing that ends up backfiring. Like, so for like, even I think One Belt, One Road is basically kind of stupid because in 2013, 2014, China, as you know, lent like hundreds of billions of dollars to all these countries. It triggered the alert of the United States. So now, the US is like, oh my God, China is like this big behemoth trying to take over the world. So that was stupid. B, a lot of the loans became non-performing because a lot of these countries cannot repay. And then of course, the US, I would say maliciously take that opportunity to say, hey, China is trying to control these countries. Like, no, they can't even get their money back. Like, if they control these countries so much, they would get their money back, but they can't, So that China is going to lose, tens and tens of billions of dollars, and actually forces China to be closer to international institutions like the IMF, because the IMF is basically going to help China repay or help these countries repay some Chinese loans. But then the IMF is controlled by the US, so then the US is using the IMF as a leverage to, narrow China's diplomatic options, et cetera, et cetera. So that whole thing was a huge mistake. And at the time, I asked, like, where did this come from? Like, did you guys recommend it to the top? They're like, no, it just came out of nowhere. Like, Xi Jinping just felt like it was a cool thing to do. He did it. We all thought it was pretty stupid also. Like, okay.
I just have one last question. So considering how inefficient all of this is and, kind of that whole top to bottom approach, do you think that over time this is unsustainable and maybe citizens will recognize that there needs to be maybe more democracy in their country, even though they're very
Yeah,
restricted?
but if you talk about that much, so that's where the censorship comes in. So you voice the exact same words that you voice online. So now they do this thing like, so not only do they censor things, right? So obviously you say like, oh, should we have democratic political system? It gets censored immediately, but a notice is sent to the local police station. It's like, this user located in this location just said the following thing. They're not going to put you in jail. They'll come visit you. So they say, hello, why did you post that online? It's like, oh, something that I watched in a YouTube video. Then they'll say, okay, that's fine. Just don't do it anymore. But if you say like, oh, this NGO that I know paid me $100 to like say stuff like that, then they're like, oh, really? Come with us. Tell us all about your NGO friends, in America, whatever. That's what they're always trying to go after. You know, they always think there's some kind of foreign plot. But you're right, a lot of times is Chinese people, they're not stupid. There are a lot of very educated people, obviously. So they often think to themselves like, well, if we had a democracy, it would be a lot better, wouldn't it? Right? But they don't dare to say that, you know.
It would like really take a revolution basically to overthrow all of this, really, because it
No,
would,
well, to the whole, that's a totally different topic, but the whole Chinese government, their number 1 job is to prevent a revolution.
Wow.
That is a lot of things that they do aim at that. I mean, that's why, so during COVID, in the leading group, right? So you look at the leading group, there was a COVID leading group. There were no health experts in the leading group, interestingly, but there was a policeman in the leading group. So the Minister of Public Security, because when there's a big natural disaster like COVID, one possibility is that it triggers a big riot, right? So the head police person in China wasn't moving.
Sorry, I know it's the book that you will be talking with the author next week, but I was curious on the chapter of like Tolok's curse, given like there's so many feedback loops that channels mainly to Xi. Do they have like a plan B mechanism for when Xi Jinping does pass away? Like, what's your opinion on that?
That will never happen. No. That's they're not, well, so think about it, right? So let's say you work for the Chinese government. You know, you're in the central government. Do you dare to voice that question? It's like, hey guys, can we talk about what happens when Xi Jinping dies? People are like sitting right next to you. So no one dares to talk about it. I mean, it's like same thing with Stalin, right? So no one dared to talk about the possibility of Stalin dying or getting sick or whatever until he literally lost consciousness and soon after died.
Right.
Everyone. So this is kind of funny. Like even when we get a lot of Chinese visitors, so a few weeks ago, we had this guy who used to work for like the China CIA, Ministry of State Security, who's now a scholar. But he like somehow the US allowed him to come to the US, visited for like 4 weeks and came to UCSD for 3 days. And he asked me that question. I was like, well, I mean, you would know, you know, more than we know. And he was like, well, but you know, we can't talk about it. Because you don't work for the Chinese government. I said, well, read my book, you know. No, actually, yeah. So my book is really about like, how do you, like when you get old and sick as a dictator, what do you do? But then what happens afterward? So right now, I think, like, so his wife actually is getting quite powerful.
oh,
So I think the plan A is his wife will take over. If he gets sick or something, his wife.
Is that possible given like how patriarchal society is?
No, but yes, he's very patriarchal, but she has the legitimacy of Xi Jinping. So there's a cult of personality. I mean, it is a tricky thing.
Would it echo some of the things with like the Gang of Four and Jiangqing with some of the
Yeah, so
technical
the
stuff?
problem with Jiangqing is Jiangqing had no support in the military. Everyone in the military hated Jiangqing.
Fair enough.
Peng Liyuan is cultivating a big power base within the military.
Okay.
That's what people tell me. So I don't know if it's true. We can empirically try to verify that. We have some data. We can try to apply some questions.
So I think my question is also a little bit off topic, but do you think US militarily speaking, mainly also involving Taiwan region, do you think US percept China's endeavors a little like they superestimate it, they get it wrong, the wrong idea?
I don't know. That's a big unknown. You know, it's like how strong is Chinese military compared to the US? By tonnage, China has the largest navy in the world. So they have, I mean, they build like 6 destroyers in 1 year. Which is unheard of. It takes us like 20 years to build 1 destroyer. China built 6 of them. I'm a skeptical about like where they get the sailors. It's like, where do you guys place? You know, stuff like that. They train a lot now too, but then it's like this kind of very, you know, orchestrated way. Real war is not the same thing. So I don't know. You know, it's like both sides are playing war games all the time. And whatever. I just don't know who's going to win. But you're right. So the big change is 10 years ago, there would be no debate. Like everyone would be like, the US would win, no problem, you know,
Yeah.
sink the entire Chinese Navy in like half an hour or whatever. Now you have like, I think people just don't know because sometimes, you know, people play war games like, oh, we beat the Chinese. Other times, oh, the Chinese beat us, you know, and China's playing war games. So who knows, right? So that's quite scary because,
Yes.
you know, that's why you don't want to fight a war. And it's not good for anyone. So China would not walk away, even if China sort of win the conflict, it would suffer horrendously because the US may not have the ability to beat China in the Taiwan Straits because it's right next to China. But the US can seal off all the trading routes, except for the land route, right? So, you know, China can trade with Russia, but Russia is a very small market. Mainly, China is still exporting to the US. And the US can certainly stop all the export even to Southeast Asia, it's far away from China. And then economically, it's a catastrophe, actually. So that's, I think some people are counting on that, but maybe Xi Jinping doesn't care, he'll start a war anyway, who knows, right? Yeah.
Kind of going on like Shirk's book Overreach, like, do you think, is there some discourse of, at least with like China with like nationalism and wolf warrior diplomacy of like, maybe we should rein some of it in or something like that?
They
Or
have done that.
they have?
It's been,
Okay,
no, yeah, it's a lot better.
okay.
Well, no, when Xi Jinping came to the US, he said the background color of US-China relationship is not one of competition, you know, it's one of cooperation, blah, blah, blah. When he said that, then all the wolf warriors are like, oh, we better shut up. Told us, you know, cooperate with the US. I think it's very superficial. You know, of
Yeah.
course, China is still competing. We know that, and you know, we say that we're still competing with China, but at least this kind of very aggressive rhetoric has been dialed back.
Do you think that will be consistent because it's kind of like the Belt and Road and like Tiangsha sort of policy of like harmony and working with the international community, and that Xi Jinping will go to the IGO, but then on the one hand, talk about like America being an aggressor.
Yeah.
And like.
No, so when he's speaking to other people or internal, that's why I say it's superficial. But at least when Chinese diplomats and scholars, when they talk to Americans now, they don't unleash on you, you know, say, oh, imperialists and blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. It's very superficial. I mean, in reality, there's, you know, obviously China's still trying to build their chips. We're trying to stop China from doing it. And, you know, there's an arms race in China. We're building up different capabilities to compete with China. So that hasn't really changed. I mean, the only thing that's changing in the margin is more trade measures against China. That I think it has to be selective, right? And there's also, you know, so even Biden's talking about more tariffs on Chinese cars or whatever. There's a way to do it using non-tariff measures. It's just kind of like what China did to foreign car companies. Like you have to build 50% of it in China. We can make Chinese companies do the same thing. You know, the software system has to be built in America, etc. Right? So, yeah.
Professor Shih, I want to thank you, and all of us want to thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure, and we've gained so much knowledge on the subject. And
Yeah.
again, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you. But you can answer.
One last question. So I saw your tweet with like the AI image of like Trump.
Oh yeah, I know.
In the Oval Office.
Yeah.
Where do you think China's kind of leading at with the 2024 election?